Hi, Max. So you are currently a student at Columbia University in the Columbia and Juilliard exchange program, and I gather studying both music and computer science. And so I'm wondering how these interests intersect, if they do, in your music.
Yeah, so I guess both of them are always a big part of how I think about anything. I think something I've come to appreciate since joining the exchange at Juilliard, I guess, and in general, just learning kinds of interdisciplinary things is to be able to use kind of everything I learn as part of a palette. Not necessarily in composition, we often talk about compositional palette, but I tend to think of the whole like world of things as that palette and just knowing different processes and different ways of thinking and being inspired by different people in different fields kind of adds to my palette no matter where I'm working or what I'm doing. So I think that's something that really comes together in my music is being able to kind of think and diversify experiences. And I think that's really important to what I'm interested in terms of like expressing myself, but also just what I'm like playing out interested in music.
Well, in the piece that you submitted for the call for score, Shatter for orchestra, we find this sense from the inspiration and just from the very beginning where it sounds, as you mentioned, like wind sweeping through a canyon, and then there's very dramatic music that finds influences from various places. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the amalgamation of influence in this piece.
Yeah, I remember. So it's been a long time since I began working on this piece. And I think having done a lot of things for my whole life, I think one thing that I wanted to do with the opportunity for this piece was definitely to, since this was one of the first chances I got to work with a big orchestra, I wanted to kind of maximize just like how much I could use or experiment with the sounds at play. So at the time, one of the big things I wanted to do was I wanted to kind of start with a bang or start with a very kind of exotified or like strange or interesting sound world that combines just the kind of power of 80 people when you have 80 people, things that are very quiet can become very loud. Kind of similarly, I think looking back on it, I think these are kinds of roots of interest that become bigger things later, such as things like electronic processing that can make quiet sounds very loud or things like that. In this, it's just the sheer volume and the kind of expression of 80 people doing various quiet things that build up to a very big dramatic kind of soundscape or shift. Those are all things that kind of speak to me and are kinds of things that are both algorithmic and I think creative in nature.
As you mentioned, this is one of your first times writing for orchestra, this
Yeah.
piece. Yeah, and so you play the violin, if I correct. And so have you played in orchestras growing up?
Yeah. I played in a youth orchestra growing up and I done a little bit from up till high school, up until around COVID hit. I was very active, played a lot of great music. That was very inspired by for sure.
And so how does your experience as a performer within the orchestra inform when you first approached writing for the orchestra and how you see yourself as a composer?
Yeah, I think typical to a lot of like young students in orchestra, I didn't play a lot of new music, or I didn't find myself in lots of opportunities to interact with people who are composers, or especially just like living musicians in general. It was kind of like we were in our own bubble and we played like Sibelius and we played Brahms and stuff. And the chances we did get to interact with contemporary music were always ones that I appreciated. I think even with the attitude of like this is a strange experience, this is a strange endeavor, I think that which I had growing up, there are still chances to kind of be part of bigger things. And I think the pieces that made me fall in love with writing for orchestra and just orchestra in general were pieces that I felt like when I experienced them were pushing the kinds of limits or musical limits or the palette forward a little bit, like Stravinsky's Firebird or Gershwin's Cuban Rhapsody. Those are not considered very contemporary pieces, but when I first approached them coming from like Mozart Violin Concerto, it was like I felt these different kinds of pieces brought in the sounds I was interested in, the sounds I was exposed to. And something like I can point to like the harmonic glissando in the first movement of Firebird. That's something that made me interested in harmonics, which put me into kind of the spectral world. And then I ran into that at Columbia with Professor Georg Haas and everything that they're doing here in New York, and that led me down this whole trail, which is still a big part of what I'm doing today. And it comes from when I was a freshman in high school playing Firebird and thinking this is like one of the coolest sounds I've ever heard.
Wow. Well, it's interesting and beautiful how a formative experience like that can put you on a path. I know you mentioned the word spectral, and for our audiences, there's who may not be familiar with that term, is a style of and way of thinking about music composition called spectral music, um, where composers are analyzing the timbre of sound and finding harmonies embedded within the overtone series, and then creating work based on that. So it's using the beauty of the texture of sound itself, of perhaps just one instrument, to imagine a whole orchestral soundscape in some way. So when you're thinking of this piece, I know you mentioned also inspired by systems, and here not computer systems per se, but the systems of society, the societal institutions and their complex web of interrelations. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that element of the
Yeah.
inspiration.
So I first started working on this piece at a time where lots of different things were changing at the same time, including just with my music career, but also around me and everywhere basically in the world. Um, I think we've like kind of crossed the age where pandemic pieces or that kind of idea is a very old thing almost now that everyone's done it and it's been programmed a lot. But I think being a composer or just thinking about music or having this project to work on during that time, um, it was like a time where we were challenged to think about why we were doing things and what we're doing, or kind of everything flipping around in that suddenly we're not like going to work or we're not interacting with people, or I'm going to college on Zoom. And then that intersected with a lot of new kinds of movements in like social justice and things like that, intersecting with being a 19-year-old or 20-year-old person who's entering his first year of college, also combined with me studying music formally for the first time. All of these things kinds of were all systems that so many things are changing at once that you almost take like a approximate approach to it. There's no way to kind of formalize how much everything is changing. All we can do is experience what our bodies tell us and what our bodies react to. In a kind of way, I don't know if this is a good comparison to make, but it's like understanding something that's created by an AI is like an amalgamation of a bunch of experiences, and you can't abstract them out back into their own things anymore. That's kind of the kind of way of thinking that kind of goes into this piece. Is I realized that there are so many things changing and so many things flipping in and of ourselves. And what I wanted to do was kind of flip that into my own musical thing, where I was breaking what I knew about orchestration or what I knew about theory, or taking my old interests, things that were from the past or from a year ago. A lot of the things in the piece are kind of built out of thinking about old pieces I wrote or pieces that have never been heard before, or little fragments of things like the Stravinsky that I talked about, and like a bunch of other experiences that lead into little choices, but then cohere themselves into kind of just its own new experience. So I wouldn't say it's like a direct reflection, but I think upon working on this and during the process of working on this, I kind of came to appreciate the idea of all these systems and things. And even just going on a walk during the pandemic where everything's so quiet, just thinking about how much the environment or the system or the underlying structures of things have changed.
Mm.
Um, and then kind of building that in my own way based on just my musical interests, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I was interested. You mentioned breaking the orchestration or harmony or writing in some way. Wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you think about breaking something.
Yeah, I guess at the time I had a much more, I think at the time I hadn't really studied a ton of like what was going on. I kind of came to a naive approach of like, at the time I was writing a lot of music where I was like, oh, this is really cool. And over time I would find that lots of other people had already done it before. And I was like, oh, I guess I wasn't that cool at the time. But I do think that the approach I took on this one was novel for me personally. And in the space I was able to explore these things that had been explored before, but I kind of took them in my own way in building this kind of like almost spectral world of like lots of harmonics and resonances, artificial resonances built off of things. and then combining that with some more like triadic or diatonic harmony, like kinds of little seventh chords and things that pop out, and even some kind of brash like Stravinsky-esque like big chord hits and stuff. Those are all just things that I kind of um build together. I guess I'm digressing from the question, but yeah, that's kind of where I was looking at in this piece. There's lots of different things coming together, I guess.
Yeah.
My own way. Yeah.
So I wonder, with this piece, has this process of composition continued in other works, or is it localized in this concept for Shatter, which the title, of course, is reflected in this compositional process? But I'm curious.
Yeah. I think it was almost a product of the time, which was that it was a very kind of curious time for me. I think being a really young person and studying a lot of things, I almost came to it with the thought that, this might be one of my only chances to do this whole thing. And so I kind of had the pressure to like, oh, I'm going to like put as much of my musical bucket list into this piece as possible. And I still maintain that in a way, but having, I guess, or being fortunate enough to have more access to, musicians now that COVID is over and that we're back in school, having more projects to work on and more musical things going on in general, I have less of the pressure to cram all of my interests into one. But something I've been really focusing on doing is taking the interests one at a time and saying, what can I fully flesh out with this idea? Or I've been having these ideas recently of just small little mathematical changes and magnifying them in terms of like minimalist time scales. Like these little things are all interests that maybe were realized in one phrase in Shatter, which was only a 4 or 5, or I think it's like a 6 minute piece, compared to I could turn any one of those phrases and really dig deeper into it. What kind of musical experiences can I come from just focusing on, one thing in my bucket list rather than cramming it all together? Although I would say in this case, cramming them all together made a pretty incredible experience for myself, at least.
Mhm.
It's like having all your favorite ice cream flavors in the same bowl, and just like you can't taste any of them anymore, but it's nice.
Create something, creates a whole world,
Yeah,
as Mahler was trying to do in his symphonies, though they were many times longer than 6 minutes. But
yeah.
I've experienced and had similar goals in running for an orchestra, which is a unique experience to have all these people come together, and you may not have these opportunities as often as one might hope. And so you really try to put your whole world into this moment.
Mhm.
And so I also noticed that you also are doing research in music cognition, and was wondering if this what if you could tell us a little about that, and also how if this influences how you're thinking about emotion in music.
Yeah, that was a project I did in high school. So actually, it was around the time where I first began to be interested in music. Um, so this was not a fully fledged research project, but it was kind of like a term thing for high school where I would find a mentor, and my mentor was mainly a composer. And as part of that, we worked together to just kind of collect just interest. So what I did was I talked to a lot of people. I showed people a lot of different kinds of music as a kind of auditory stimuli, and I had them listen to different pieces, and I tried to figure out what spoke to people and what didn't. Um, and at the time, I knew much less about music, or I had, I guess, I don't know if it means anything to say, more or less about music. I think just I had a much less biased, or maybe even a more biased. I don't know. Right now, I have a very biased take on music since I've kind of fully fleshed out. I'm really interested in these kinds of things. I like this kinds of things. So my ear has been fleshed out to certain things. But I think at the time, what I wanted to figure out was ways that new music or 20th century music spoke to people, or what relationship they have to people who are outside of the kind of sphere of academia in music.
Mhm.
Um, and in that, I kind of was doing the same experiment for myself, which was also in doing this, I also had to listen to all these pieces a lot of times, not just like as a stimuli for one time, but to try to open my ears as well to what things were going on, what processes were going on. I think as someone who wasn't studying music formally at the time, I never had the pressure to really think like what is 12 tone and what is like, what is new complexity and what are all these different kinds of like academic spheres or ways of thought. But part of that was just thinking about what effect does that have on someone who knows nothing? I guess that was my idea, was like, could you relate someone's musical experience? And I think now that it just has a lot to do with your auditory palette and just like what you will tolerate and what you think is interesting. But I believe framed the right way, anything can speak to anyone depending on how you frame it. Yeah.
Well, it's wonderful you in high school were looking to look at this in a scientific way, which I think is also a question that many composers are grappling with their whole life. What is an audience taking away from what I'm sharing with them, and what can I learn from the audience? How do we all listen to each other in some way?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. So I love to open it up for questions from the audience. And if you want to write anything in the chat, we'd love to pose your questions. I have oh, here's a question. Being a senior at Columbia Juilliard, what's next for you after graduating?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I've grappled with for a long time in terms of all of my interests and the things they're going forward. I mean, I've applied to master's programs, I've applied to some jobs. I have some projects still going on and which will be ongoing into at least 2025. So I guess I'm just taking it step by step. It's a time I think now at the end of my undergrad where I'm really reflecting on what my primary goals are, what things I'm really, really interested in, what things I love and don't love about everything I'm working on. And what I know for sure is that I feel like I've found a kind of I found an interest I found threads in music that I really, really love working on. And a lot of it has to do with connecting with people and understanding people better and things like that. Related to kind of my first interest, like the research I did was not as a composer. It was before I was a composer. It was just as a kind of like third party surveyor of these are all these things going on. And I think that's still something I'm interested in. So just thinking about different ways of keeping things together in my life. I think I've always been stubborn in the sense that like going from high school to college, I was like, I don't want to compromise on this. I don't want to compromise on this. And I still, I think at this point, don't see a world in which I'm not thinking about both technical things and creative things and humanity things at the same time. So what I love about the program is that they gave me the chance to do it, even if it meant I had lower priority at like, Juilliard lotteries and stuff. It's still all these things put together, there's all these little things that I'm really stubborn about. And I think that I'm confident that it's something that adds to my life and doesn't reduce from what I'm doing as a musician. I think if I were to only do music and never study any computers or anything else, again, it would be reductive to what I could produce as a musician. In the same way, other way around, if I worked and never did music again, I would be missing something and I'd be missing a creative element that would add to how I think about my work as well. So in and of itself, I guess I'm just building my path forward as it comes. But I know there's things I won't compromise on, and I know working with orchestras is my favorite thing ever. So that's what I'll keep trying to do.
Have you written for computers?
For computers, I'm working on a data sonification project where I'm taking data from NOAA, like the National Oceanographic Association, so there's publicly available data sets. And what I was doing was aggregating them and doing some data transformations to turn them into like MIDI pitches and then use them as compositional parameters for a piece. So that's one thing I'm doing right now that's very, very involved in terms of like a little bit of data science and a little bit of music and also some production skills and stuff like that. Yeah, that's one thing I'm doing. It's pretty cool. I'm actually working on it like this week. So
Great.
yeah.
One more question is, how did you first know you wanted to be a composer? I guess we learned about how you were interested in what audiences were thinking of before you knew you would be a composer, but where was this moment that you found your
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that led me towards composition was, and that's also part of what led me to that project, was that I always had pieces. I think it's a phenomenon that everyone can relate to, is just knowing that you really like this certain song or certain piece, and knowing that you like this 30-second part of it or whatever. And it could be an entire symphony. and you listen to the entire thing just to hear that one moment happen, or the 2 minutes happen in the middle that you really like, or the your favorite melody of all time from like Rachmaninoff or something. Those are all things, or they're like, the entire Rachmaninoff prelude in G minor. I'll listen to it just for the part where the arpeggios in the middle. Those are just things that kind of were bouncing around my mind, and kind of perusing those scores and thinking, why do I like this? Or kind of thinking, do I have to listen to the whole 10 minutes to be able to experience that one part? Keying in on that feeling, I guess, of just like, it is what enabled me to think maybe I could write this thing, except I like it the entire time through, or like that there's something in these parts that I can explore that's really interesting. And the first thing I learned is just that I like seventh chords, which led me to study a little bit of music theory on my own. But then that's the whole snowball into like I start liking these modes of thinking, or I experiment with those things. And it gets broader and broader. So there's never a moment where I knew I wanted to write music, but there's a moment in which I became interested enough to kind of take my own stab at making things, or making the sounds I want to hear, I guess. Or it was just the thought that there were sounds in my head that weren't existing, and I could make them exist, I guess.
That's wonderful. It's interesting that my formative experience of wanting to become a composer, when my parents got us a piano, I sat down, and the chord that I absolutely loved that made me want to start writing music was also a seventh chord.
Yeah.
And for those in the audience, a seventh chord is a chord that has four notes that spans the interval of a seventh. If you go do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, from do to ti, from 1 to 7, scale degree 1 to 7, and you have scale degrees 1, 3, 5, 7. You have a triad, which is a major chord, and you add a slight dissonance on top. And so the chord that I loved was an F major 7 chord with the F, A, C, and E. And I'm wondering, did you have a favorite seventh chord?
Yeah, I mean, I could play some. There's ones I still like, I would say, abuse in all of my pieces. And um one of the people in the audience has played one of my pieces that's filled with these chords. But it began with just like any seventh chord was like a cool moment, aha moment. It's like my palette was so reduced that when I just discovered that you could add a note to a triad, it was a huge moment for me. But then from then on, I guess it became more like voicings of triads. One of the first things I discovered was this, like, I think this is maybe like an 11th or something. I don't even remember. I don't know, but this sound is stacked fifths and then a minor second in between them. So in principle, it's just a C minor 9 11, C minor 11th, and then just the idea of having fifths stacked together was a kind of amazing thing to me. Is that it sounds so open but so kind of jazz in the same thing. And then I also discovered nice fourths, such as in Spirited Away, there's this chord, which also has a kind of seventhy feeling, but the what I've discovered later is that the actual feeling is more like pentatonic or open. And then one that I abuse all the time is this, which I can't decide if it's an F minor chord or a D flat inversion. But these are just different chords that all buzz my ears, and I use them everywhere. Um, in Shatter, the main thing is actually just the 3-note thing, which is this, and then that becomes this, and then that becomes like this. Right, in lots of different forms. And then that's kind of what the whole piece began, with me playing this on the piano and then thinking, oh, that sounds pretty cool. Yeah.
It sounds like when my dog comes on the piano, puts his paw
Yeah,
down,
yeah.
the three notes are right next to each other.
Yeah.
But you can find a whole world in that and how you expand on it.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, those are beautiful chords, and we'll look forward to hearing more of these chords and new ones in future work.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you guys for doing this. It's been a lot of fun.